But I'm going to turn the program over to David Bundy, and he's going to lead us through the afternoon. Come, David. Please join me in welcoming him. Okay.
Thank you for your kind introduction. I'm going to disprove several of his theories between now and the end of the session. And what he's doing now is handing out an outline so that you will be able to keep track of where I'm going and feel increased relief as we approach the end. When I was asked to do the wee project on world Methodism, this caused me a bit of wry reflection. The first thing is, what in the world is world Methodism? And so what I'd like us to do today is put our minds together to think a little bit about the contours of the problem. As a youth growing up in the Free Methodist Church, I was aware that there were other Methodists in my small town of Madras, Oregon, but I had never met any, and and there were no children in that Methodist church in our school. But it was a very beautiful building up on top of a hill. When I moved to Seattle Pacific University, I discovered that life was not the way I had known it. I was like somebody who sent their DNA into Ancestry.com and woke up to discover that they were related to all kinds of people who they didn't know about, and some of them they didn't even like. And I was forced to come to terms with the disturbing reality that the AMEZ, Pentecostal, Charismatic Anglicans, Mormons, and other churches, as well as peacenik hippies, were not all that different from me. And some of these I found more congenial, both theologically and sociologically, to my Free Methodist friends. But you won't tell them that, of course. Now, since those halcyon days in Seattle, I have been the bearer of bad tidings to a lot of people, as I have told them about their religious DNA. The lack of awareness of religious historical connections is not just an American problem. As far as I can tell, it has extended to pretty much the entire world. Most of us in every generation are pretty sure we're getting it right, and the other folk didn't get it right, didn't do so, and that story goes on. But often the problem is just that nobody ever explained it. During my missionary work in Indianapolis, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, I have frequently brought people to tears at the discovery of their global religious traditions. Perversely, for me, that used to be one of my goals when I would go off to these churches to speak to them about it. The more people I had in tears, the better I thought I had done. So I'll be counting today to see how many of you are weeping at the end, out of joy as they were. But early on, the solution proposed to me, and not by my Free Methodist friends, unfortunately, was ecumenism. But I discovered that ecumenism was very successful at a local level among clergy, but not so much among the laity, and that it was driven by upper level agendas and not by the people on the ground. And this is true both in Europe and in North America and through the areas of the world influenced by these. Now, my proposal for us today is a discussion for my part of this session is the reason in the discussion of the term world Methodism and how we got it and what it might mean, as well as other problematic terms of a similar sort. Then to suggest issues of historiography and ecumenism and world Methodism, and then suggest some problems, as examples of problems and opportunities provoked by these definitions. And finally, at the end, as one should in a good Methodist context, I'm going to give a historiographical altar call. Now, since at least 1951, aspects of what I experienced in Seattle have been described as world Methodism. The term world Methodism shares a problematic assumption of other language used to describe Christians not viewed as integral to the established churches of North America and England. In some ways, Methodists were at the forefront of this world term, adopting in 1951 the term World Methodist Council to replace the group entitled Ecumenical Methodist Conference, having surrendered the term ecumenical to Geneva and New York. Such terms as world Christianity, intercultural studies, autochthonous, indigenous, and mission studies have become ways both to describe perceived distance between groups and to categorize them to our advantage. The generalizing terms African, Oriental, and for that matter, North American and European are used as ways to diminish interconnection. These terms each make their assumptions and both categorize their resources and structures. The terms also reflect the relative economic strength and the flow of funds, with conditions from mission and social agencies of both the right and the left resident in North America and in Europe. It appears somewhat to my distress that there is no term without problems. Take, for instance, the term autochthonous. It's a cumbersome term developed by the Orthodox, which took into account political realities and divided the church into what became national churches among the Orthodox. There, the assumption is generally that the influences across borders become minimal when autochthonous status was granted. In reality, of course, it was always more complicated than that. The word Oriental, Orientalist, despite the analysis of Said and a multitude of other scholars and politicians, this category, often used in more polite modern renditions, retains its generalizing and derogatory semantic range. Ecumenism. The ecumenical movement sought to smooth out the particulars, all the time refusing to recognize that their global census was being outstripped by groups that liked particularity. Their competitors, including brethren, not Bilkis Levy's friends, but so much, but the brethren, the English brethren, the closed and open Darby folks, Holiness Baptist and Pentecostal movements, their competitors, including these brethren, Holiness Baptist and Pentecostal movements, were of a different social status, usually with minimal social or political capital. With few exceptions, their presence was generally ignored until the 1980s. Dissenters who found aspects of their thought attractive were isolated. Their converts were sometimes sought out for silencing and re-education, as in the Église Réformée de France and the Disciples of Christ of Puerto Rico. Since the ecumenical movement was predicated on access to power and money, as was the earlier Evangelical Alliance, it has generally ignored the relative masses of other Christians. And I would argue that the newer invention, Christians Together, has the same exclusivist, non-particularist professional orientation. The term indigenous. It was generally assumed that daughter churches needed permission to be free of North American and European churches, and that it was the latter the North American and European churches, we decided when a church had achieved indigeneity. Mission studies and intercultural studies. I will have no friends left after I get to the end of the list. Assuming we're ready to start. Mission studies and its more polite form, intercultural studies, assumes that the missionary was a central actor for the history of the newer churches and that their culture is more acceptable as it becomes more acceptable to North American and European culture, both evangelical and of the right and left of North American and European Christianity. The new name, intercultural studies, does not answer the critics of mission. It continues the trajectory of the older scholarship, and I have long observed it to be a computer-esque search and replace editing project more than a change of orientation. Both insist on making the other more like us. World Christianity. And I've been somewhat involved in the definition of this up to now, and I'm not happy with where it is. But anyway, that's another story. Much writing about the new discipline, so-called, of world Christianity assumes it is based on an interdisciplinary model. World Christian Studies, which is my title in New York, is promising in that it assumes that there are commonalities between the versions of Christianity and argues for diachronic and synchronic analysis. As well, it argues for taking more seriously the sources and experiences of those outside of the missionary orbit, but also taking the missionary and their cultures into account. It falters in my sense, and this is one of the things that I think we still have to work on carefully. It lacks a certain methodological clarity, which is a problem of all efforts that are defined as multidisciplinary. Secondly, the assumption, and especially a couple of German scholars, Korschke and Kohlmann, have pushed this, that there is the assumption that there is a single unitary phenomenon of world Christianity to be analyzed. And third, my third problem I would recognize with this is the continuing Western, non-Western dichotomy while prioritizing the non-Western. I'm not opposed to prioritizing the non-Western, I'm opposed to dividing the two and not looking at the overlaps. For these reasons, I and others have preferred terms like world Christian movements and world Christianities. Whenever I type those, my spell checker puts a red line under them, but I think that they are still better terms for what we might want to be describing. There's a wonderful essay by Dorothea Nagy, published Brill 2017, in which she looks at the methodological issues of world Christianity, and is well worth pursuing. Now, having said all this, these nasty things about various people's disciplines and favorite words, I would say that Methodists and those who trace aspects of their history to Methodism, including the holiness movements and Pentecostalism, have the possibility of contributing significantly to the methodological discussions of world Christianity, or world Christianities. The churches and movements related to each of these streams is diverse, and they are located in diverse cultural contexts. They are linguistically and geographically widespread. Nowhere were they state churches, although they have approached being such in several countries, especially the Methodist Church in the USA. That would be another session for us one day. The connections between the Methodist Church and power, and political power in the United States, and how it was used. In light of the world Christianity's approach, I'm exploring a bit issues of identity, and arguing that world Methodism must begin with a new frontier in the ecumenism of history and religious experience. But before I move to suggestions about the future, let me begin with an analysis of the state of the study of world Methodism. So we've now moved on to point 4. I think, yes. I want to point out a few hallmark moments in the beginning of this term of world Methodism. And in a sense, the first concretized element of this was the Methodist Ecumenical Conference in London in 1881. It was proposed in 1876, but it took a little while to get it organized. We Methodist types are not fast. The AME, AMEZ, and CME were included. I'm not sure how many of the people listed in the document actually managed to attend. The editors knew there was a bit of a problem, where they noted, and this is a quote, those loosely called the Latin races, the numbers were small. There was, however, in attendance no African-born and residing in Africa, nor any native Asiatic, American Indian, or Polynesian. So at least that World Methodism project began with a bad conscience. There were also no Scandinavians. They weren't mentioned, but they weren't there. There were Methodists there. No holiness churches were represented. The Free Methodists, V.T. Roberts and J. Travis, were listed as having been invited, but neither of them attended. A very dark view of the rest of the world is seen in those documents, and one of the Methodist missionaries who quite independently, which was really the big problem, who was trying to work on that problem, William Taylor, 2 pages of the report were devoted to explaining why he was wrong and they were right. The World Methodist Council in 1951, stepping just forward a bit, 40 independent groups were named, with the assertion that the rest of the Methodist family, about 160 groups, were dependent on the churches of North America and Europe. In 1971, it was decided at a meeting in Denver that quote-unquote third world participants should be welcomed at the Methodist World Conference. So you can see the slow evolution of the bad conscience to eventually maybe making a decision about this. Now, when one looks at the histories of Methodist mission, these describe the founding of the Methodist-related churches around the world, almost always on the basis of only missionary and official Methodist sources from the major North American and European denominations. Now, in 1974, a major event happened, which I still find quite stunning: the publication of the Encyclopedia of World Methodism. It was edited by Nolan B. Harmon, who was initially known most widely for his opposition to civil rights, and who later repented of that. But I suspect that the major players in the organizing of the encyclopedia were the 2 women who were his assistants, Albia Godbold and Louisa L. Queen. Despite the fact that the mugshots of the editors and listening contributors looked somewhat like photographs of the Republicans in the House, this encyclopedia remains the most diverse for the world in its and the most diverse and the most world in its coverage of world Methodism. Most, if not all, of the discussions of Methodism outside of North America were contributed by missionaries. The coverage of immigrant and African American Methodism is scanty. Of the holiness churches, only the Church of the Nazarene, the Free Methodist, and Wesleyan Church received articles. No Pentecostal influences were mentioned, not even in Norway and Chile, where arguably they should really have been, not to mention the United States. But I am humbly grateful to the editors of the Encyclopedia of World Methodism, because without them, they pull together material, often without bibliography, but with hints on many places and many people in the world. It is a wonderful thing indeed. Now, jumping forward to the World Methodist Council in 2019, we still recognize a certain, shall we say, ecclesiastical limitation on what is World Methodism. It is made up of 80 Methodist, this is a quote from the website. It is made up of 80 Methodist, Wesleyan, and related uniting and united churches representing over 80 million members in 138 countries, end quote. The only holiness churches listed are the Free Methodists, Nazarenes, and Free Methodists. No Pentecostal churches are listed. This is not unrelated to an article published in 2016 by Billy Abraham, in which he, in responding to the conference at Portland, indicated that the United Methodist Church has awakened to discover that it is a global church. But which is even more poignant, I think, after the most recent meeting. But I recommend that article to you, and if you're interested, you can give me your email and I'll send you a link for it. It's available online. You can probably find it, but if you search for Billy Abraham, you'll find 2 million things. And so this will help you sort that out a little bit. But now, look, I want to spend a few minutes impugning several of my other friends by looking at handbooks, encyclopedias, and dictionaries. The Oxford Handbook of Methodist Studies, edited by William Abraham and James Kirby in 2009, is primarily focused on North American issues, but does endeavor to include the rest of the world with essays on the UK, Latin America, and Africa, but nothing on Asia. There is nothing regarding the holiness Pentecostal churches. There is a discussion of issues of approaches to mission, but not thinking about the results of mission. But it's a nice handbook and a great big thing, and worth you having. The T&T Clark Companion to Methodism, edited by Charles Jurgen, is perhaps the most World Methodist of any work on Methodism. There are brilliant essays on North America and the UK, but also on Africa by Karewa, by Asia and Pacific by Luther O'Connor, who I pray is on his way here, Northern and Continental Europe by Ulrich Schuler, Russia and the Baltics by Rüdiger Meiners, Latin America, Caribbean by Paulos Matos. And astonishingly, there are no, to my mind, there are no articles on women, race, or mission. And the dictionary in the second half of the volume is focused on North America and Britain, and no recent literature in any of those dictionary articles regarding Methodism or the continents or the other on other continents. The Cambridge Companion to American Methodism, edited by Jason Vickers, while focused justifiably on North America, which is its title after all, there is no attention to the migration of Methodists from Europe and Latin America to North America. There's also no attention given to mission. And I must say that having edited a couple of things, the fact that I've been delinquent in my own duties from time to time, when the finished product is sometimes the best that any editor can do. Many people, it's hard to find people to write for these things, and so I'm not when I'm suggesting that these things are not being included. I'm not impugning the editors, but it's more citing the problems that we all face. Now, the Ashgate Research Companion to World Methodism has a good title. Edited by my friends William Gibson, Peter Forsyth, and Mark Wellings, published in All My Prayers Have Been Answered. published in 2013. This volume contains statistical analysis of World Methodists by David Jeremy, including a lot of helpful discussion of who has been considered Methodist and the problem of collecting numbers. But the only essay with a discussion of a more global approach is the essay of Priscilla Pope Levison on holiness and Pentecostal movements within Methodism. The rest is focused quite narrowly on North America and Europe, even when calling for wider scale research. There are no essays on race and mission. I did not find non-English language sources or bibliography of which there is much to be found. The title in my sense did not live up to the billing, despite the editors of the work of the editors. I have no idea when we started, so I'll just go along until Steve starts exuding negative karma from the back row. He's good at that. And sometimes it's really quite necessary, but with my glasses off, I can't see him. So, but now I'd like to turn to some examples and problems provoked by these definitions, and to suggest that definitional problems are not new. To begin with France and Switzerland, and here I need to give apologies for my friend Jean-Louis Prunier. We were planning to do a team thing today where I was going to talk about things in France, and he was going to talk about the mission history outside of France. His wife became ill, and he is unable to join us today, and at least as far as 20 minutes ago, I had not received a paper from him. So we will do without that, but we'll tell you to talk about one part of the story now. The case of France and Switzerland. The Wesleyan Methodist Church arrived in France the first missionary arrived the year Wesley died, 1791. William Mahy, as he's called in France, I don't know what he's called in England, came and 1791. He stayed there until 1810, working exclusively in the Channel Islands, Guernsey and Jersey, and in which were French-speaking, and also then in Brittany, which is highly Catholic even to this day, but at that point, and even now, highly alienated from the Catholic Church. He developed some kind of a problem, I suspect it was a brain tumor, and returned to England in 1810, where he died in 1813. In 1818, a second Wesleyan Methodist missionary was sent, Charles Cook, whose great-grandchildren are still today involved in the Église Unie de France. They worked very carefully in Normandy as well as Brittany, moved down south to the area near Montpellier, Nîmes, and then up the Rhone River into the mountains of Switzerland. They worked primarily in the villages, doing missionary work in villages, establishing churches, just at the time that all of the folks, in order to survive, were leaving the villages and going off into the cities, the first wave of urbanization within France. So they followed the converts to Paris and to Toulouse and the other Lyon and other major cities, but in that kind of a context, they were so spread out, it was hard to keep track of them and keep up with them. And it was hard to attract them because coming from the other side, coming from Neuchâtel and Geneva, were two versions of what is called the Réveil, the revival, the awakening. And the one from Geneva was heavily concerned about, is the Bible true? The kind of proto-fundamentalist issues under the attack of European, they were concerned about the Bible being under attack of European liberalism and modernism and all that kind of thing that managed to finally get to the United States in 1912 or so. And from Neuchâtel, they were more worried about spirituality. They were organizing break-in cell groups and doing sanctification meetings and consecration meetings, and they are the ones that then move into Paris area primarily and develop the things like the Bible Society, the Mission Society, and all this kind of, which a lot of people who were converted by Methodists joined their project. Now, the woman's name, Marguerite, was number 3 on the list. Coralie Armagard Hinch was was born of Danish pietist parents, and she was raised in the Église Réformée de France, and joined the Wesleyans in 1838. She also preached in the Channel Islands and attracted 600-700 people at a time, which was more than any of the boys could attract. And then she went to preaching on the continent, and as she traveled throughout France, she would attract groups of 3, 4, 5, 7,000 people. But she became convinced that the Wesleyan Methodist Church was lax with regard to 2 things: sanctification and ministry to the poor. And so she split off from the Wesleyan Methodist Church and founded her own ministry in Nîmes with no name. It was just always called Madame Hinch's ministry. She bought several hectares of land, quite a large number of acres of land in the middle of Nîmes, and built buildings that you can go walk around today. She built a house for women who were abused. She developed an orphanage. She developed a school for people who couldn't afford to go to school. She developed a system of baths. She said, she had learned from the Romans that it was a good thing for a city to have baths, and so she developed baths so the poor people could take baths. She was a pacifist. She was a strong believer in the dichotomy of good and evil. She knew what it was when she saw it. She argued for the need for conversion, which was a delicate theme in France, and for sanctification. Most of the Methodists were excited about it because of the way Catholics had used the term. She was committed to ministry of the poor, and as far as I know, she's the only woman in France other than William Booth's daughter, to found a denomination. Now, the Salvation Army, as I mentioned, William Booth's daughter arrived. She became known as La Marchelle, the Marshal, and she, of course, her parents had left the Methodist Church because of the issues of sanctification and ministry to the poor and women preaching. And so, funded, supported by the Baptist Congregationalist, or Congregationalist Baptist at this time of his life, holiness leader and philanthropist William Francis Crossley. From Manchester, she founded the Salvation Army in France, which is still going strong. The French government, after the war, made it an offer it could not refuse. It was told that it could either minister without regard to the conversion of the folk. In other words, you can't ask them to get converted in order to give them something, or you could leave. So they decided to stay and are doing a wonderful ministry within France. Once again, a daughter church of Methodism. La Mission Populaire Évangélique, founded in 1871 by a Scottish Congregationalist who had been contaminated by the holiness movement. He created a denomination in France. It had close ties with the holiness movement and with French Methodism. At one point, it was negotiating to join the Salvation Army. It had later developed close ties with the social gospel people, or as they're called in France, Christianisme Social. They're not related to Rauschenbusch and are not like the American branch or the British branch of Hugh Price Hughes, the Methodist, but they have their own kind of particular take on ministry to the poor, heavily informed by Methodism and the holiness movement. But anyway, the Mission Populaire is still going. They have about 100 churches in France and headquarters in Paris, and once again do a wonderful ministry. The Assemblies of God in France, most people would not in their right minds think at this moment, maybe any time, about them being related to Methodism. But if you start looking at the history of that organization, you see that most of its early leadership came not from the Reformed tradition, not from the Église Réformée de France, but from the Salvation Army. A friend of mine has has chased down about 90% of the identity of the first generation of leadership, and most of those were Salvation Army. The other ones were heavily influenced by various other streams, including Methodism and holiness churches. So in a sense, what in the world is World Methodism in France? Now, if you say it's the Wesleyan Methodist Church, well, that stopped in 1938 because that merged into the Église Unie de France, which is, at least titularly, a member of the World Methodist Council, or World Methodist Council. The Methodism is, as one prominent French Protestant or scholar of Protestant scholar of Protestantism told me, Methodism in France is a closed parenthesis. That is, it began in 1818 with the arrival of Cook, and that, from their point of view, and it stopped in 1938, and after that, it is gone and irrelevant. It is no longer present. But even in the Église Réformée de France, which now the Église Unie de France, if you look at the hymn book, there are stacks of hymns brought over from the Methodists and from the Mission Populaire and from the holiness movements within the ERF. And as we're going to hear later, these songs have a remarkable endurance. So what in the world is World Methodism in France? Is it one of them, all of them, none of them? There's the only Methodist church in France now are the 12 congregations that are part of the conference that includes the Swiss and others, chaired by our friend and colleague Patrick Struck as the bishop. Is that what Methodism in France is? Now looking at the case of Norway. Norway was like many areas of the Methodist churches, planted in countries around the world in the last half of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th. From its inception in Norway, it was interconnected with holiness movements and folk, the further movements inside of USA Methodism, and from the 1870s onward with radical holiness movements outside that tradition. It grew up in Norway in contexts that were heavily influenced by Norwegian pietists, especially the Hogian pietists. It self-consciously drew on the Hogian pietism as in its intellectual and spiritual resources. Now, the Methodist Church in Norway started in you can almost say 1849, when Ole Peter Peterson was converted and experienced sanctification in the United States. He was sent off to minister, to be an evangelist for the Norwegian immigrants in Iowa for about 3 years before he sought and received appointment as a missionary by Bishop Beverly Waugh, who was happy to ordain people, skipping over things like the Missionary Society to send them on around the world. Missionary Society, I'm the bishop, I will send them. Which becomes a real bone of contention later on within Methodism. But he remained in Methodism, in Norway for only a few years, but then came back to the United States to continue to work with Norwegians who were wandering about here. He wrote a theology book, published it in 1900, in which he describes, he changes the doctrine of conversion and sanctification. You have new birth, you have entire sanctification, which he viewed as juridical, and then you have Christian perfection as another level, which he considered growing in spirituality after you have been sanctified. So he split that experience into two parts, reflecting his Hogian Pietist Lutheran tradition. Now, the Free Methodists quickly got involved, and this happened through a person by the name of Silvert Ulnes. Now, Ulnes is actually the name of his hometown. When he arrived at Ellis Island as an immigrant, as his late childhood, early teenage years, the people at Ellis Island couldn't do anything with his name, so they just gave him one based on his hometown, their hearing of the way he pronounced that. But he wore that made-up name for the rest of his life, as have his descendants. But Silver Illness was converted in the context of by the Pentecost bands, the more radical aspects of the Free Methodist Church. He married one of his co-workers and became a licensed minister in the Free Methodist Church. The Illnesses were sent to Norway at his request as a Pentecost band in 1890, and they went to a small village where he knew everybody, because that's where he was from, and established the village of Sogndal and founded a chapel called Zion. It hit the Norwegian newspapers quickly because of their loud music, their enthusiastic dancing during the services, their being slain in the spirit, and other bits of wild physical manifestations related to baptism of the Holy Spirit. In 1891, the Free Methodist Church had enough of such enthusiasm in North America that they forced the bands to pull out of the church, and Illnesses were faced with a decision. They chose to remain within the Free Methodist Church. He started, like many good Methodists do, a periodical entitled Tongue of Fire, named after the title, borrowing the title from William Arthur's book, Tongue of Fire, published in 1858, Ildtungen, and he later retitled it the equivalent of Truth and Freedom. Now, his little congregation had about 150 people, but the periodical they published circulated more than 6,000 titles. I mean, 6,000 paid copies. This meant that there were a lot of these things circulating, and what they were publishing is really interesting, at least to me. They were publishing people like Vivian Dake, founder of the Pentecost bands, B.T. Roberts, Anna Abrams from the Vanguard Mission in St. Louis, Phoebe Palmer, E.B. Shellhammer, Sarah Cook, who is the one who somewhat got Moody sanctified, William Boardman, William Taylor, William Boardman actually a lot, Otto Wirth, a Swedish holiness evangelist, Otto Stockmeyer, a Swiss-German evangelist. Otto is a good name for a holiness evangelist. And they translated this material into Norwegian, and it went throughout Scandinavia and Iceland. I found 2 fascicles of this in the National Library in Reykjavik, so at least those had made it there. Now, Ulnes eventually withdrew from the Free Methodist Church over issues of mission approach and ecclesiology, and he did so under the influence of his wife and the next person I want to mention to you, Eric Anderson. Eric Anderson was a sailor who experienced baptism of the Holy Spirit in some port in the United States. I have no idea which port. When he returned to Norway, he immediately became a a wandering revivalist, met Frederick Franzen, who was the founder of the Scandinavian Alliance Mission, and became a speaker for that mission. Once again, issues of authority were problematic, and he withdrew. He printed and reprinted translations of American Methodist and Holiness literature, as well as Swedish Lutheran Pietist materials. He was heavily influenced not only by the Wesleyan and Methodist folk, but also by A.J. Gordon, Charles Grandison Finney, and William Borden. He provided the shelter for the next person I'm going to mention, who got kicked out of the Norwegian Methodist Church, Thomas Ball Barrett. For years, Thomas Ball Barrett was the most important proponent of Methodism in Norway. He was the son of a British Wesleyan Methodist mining engineer, and he quickly became district superintendent, which he was for years in Oslo. He was part of the Oslo City Council. He was heavily involved in achieving the freedom of Norway from Sweden, but he got caught between this problem of the mission board and the bishops, ended up taking refuge at first in A.B. Simpson's guest house, where he went off to a suburb of New York, got baptized in the Holy Spirit Pentecostal style in a Black Holiness Pentecostal church with the involvement also of some Canadian women. And he went back to Oslo. He was kicked out of the Methodist Church in 1909, so 2 years he was out. Now that was probably a good thing for him, but it was a bad thing for the Methodists, because the Methodist Church was about 5,000 people then. It is fewer than 5,000 people now, and the Pentecostal traditions that he started in Norway have become very important. And he himself, of course, you have periodicals. He published them in various languages, and is the founder of Pentecostalism throughout Europe and throughout much of the world. More of it is probably more territory. Pentecostal territory happens Pentecostal from there than from the United States. But that's another story. I've been told that I need to skip my next couple of sections on Korea and Chile and the United States and all of that kind of stuff. I'm sorry, I thought it wouldn't take me so long to tell those stories, but I need to get to the altar call part. So, and one can tell that same complexifying story about world Methodism in every country I have looked at, and I've looked at a lot of them. That question is all the same. So the problem is we need to figure out how we are going to define world Methodism if it is going to be world Methodism. Now, we have a certain privilege in our part of the world that others don't necessarily have, related to mostly to money, but also to intellectual resources that have been preserved. But so I want to say some things we can't say. We can't say that you are us or that we are together. We have to wait a while before anything like that can be said. We cannot take a unified theory of culture, ecclesiology, or theology as a goal. The exclusionary results of the ecclesiological, from my mind, in the World Methodist Council approach is all too clear. We cannot approach it with the idea that we are the older or wiser, or the original version of Methodism. We cannot insist on the inspired nature of the Wesley corpus. Our fellow believers have found many other saints in addition to or in place of the Wesley brothers and Fletcher to mentor them for a variety of reasons. The return to Wesley agenda of the Wesleyan Theological Society and the general avoidance of the 19th century in our society, as well as in hiring in history departments in holiness movement and Methodist institutions, does not serve us well. We need to be open to new engagements. But what we can do, we can work on questions of method, the historical analysis of Methodist developments or assimilation. We can approach it in a non-ideological way, using network theory and using a phenomenological philosophical approach. We can explore it diachronically and synchronically with an awareness that some of our colleagues may have changed directions and may hardly recognize that they are that they carry the same DNA that we do. We can develop networks of friendship and discourse, learning stories, religious experiences and visions, and seek historical connections. We can again begin to hire scholars of Methodist and holiness traditions. Methodists have generally done better at this than holiness folks have. We can remember that there is an ecumenical challenge in the examination of history and religious experience. We can strive to overcome political wedge issues related to spirituality, class, race, gender, abortion, homosexuality, you name any of the rest of them. Importantly, we have to figure out what kind of a goal we're going to strive for. Do we want a little tent, a little World Methodist tent, like say, ecclesiologically defined like the World Methodist Council? Do we want a bigger tent that includes everybody who puts the word Methodist in their name, which would already be quite an interesting thing? Do we want a bigger tent still that includes everybody who has a Methodist impulse? Whatever that might be, that requires some more thought too. Or do we want the biggest tent of all to be open to all of the daughters and granddaughters and cousins of Methodism and including sometime relatives of Methodism? I just saw this term, sometime relative. And I think it's a wonderful phrase. I have no idea what it means. Including relatives who we might consider both legitimate and illegitimate. But anyway, I would argue that we should seek to understand our commonalities and our differences and to work for a bigger definition of what it means to talk about World Methodism. Thank you.
David is certainly willing, and I think you can see, more than able to entertain a few questions. I won't moderate much, but I will keep us at time. We're going to take a break here just a little bit and take a group photo together just outside, and then we'll have our next paper, and after that, then we'll have afternoon refreshments, which has been provided for us downstairs. One other detail, anyone interested in going to dinner together tonight? We've generally done that. And I can make a reservation for a group. Anybody want to go? Anyone at all? If you do, raise your hand. Good. Let's let me get a count. Hi, please. Okay. All right. Good. I'll find us a place to go nearby. Okay. Good enough. Questions for David?
Well, hi, George. One thing I was trying to do was relate this to something that I've learned in missions dealing with 1040 window. The 1040 window basic.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so I was trying to get an idea. Number one, from you, if that's even you consider something to be legitimate, and then number two, is there like a direct or focused effort in Methodists to try to target a particular area to maybe do more mission work or something to that nature?
That's a question I can't answer really. I have not been close enough for too long to the mission organizations of all of these North American churches. I am a little suspicious of, now I'm going into confession, I'm a little suspicious of any of these mission plans or viewing the world in those kinds of ways. Because it's always, we've got everything and you don't. Now, there are people who would make that argument and try to sustain it. That's the case, that's just the reality. But as I wander about, I have yet to find some place where there aren't Christians. And the question that I have is, why not work with Christians who are already in these quote-unquote 1040 places? And if there aren't many of them, it's often our fault. I've lost a lot of friends in Baghdad who are just dead, who were some of the most brilliant scholars of Asian Christianity who I've ever known. And that was our fault as a nation. I've got other areas, there are other areas where evangelical friends have been brought into question because of policies of evangelicals in our part of the world. So to turn that into a mission program of us versus them, I'm always very leery of that myself. I'm in favor of finding ways to do mission that take into account and take seriously the integrity and dignity of the people that we're working with. And I think these programs that we sell in our evangelical circles, broadly understood, or are not good. And I need to say that it's not only the evangelicals who are guilty of this. I can tell you stories for longer than anybody want to hear about them, of things that have happened over the last 50 years that have been done by the left as much as by the theological right. And so I don't think there's any North American church that's totally innocent of manipulating or defining people as other for their own benefit. But so start to go wild.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, I have a question about the theology book that was written in 1900.
Yes.
Particularly splitting entire sanctification from Christian perfection. In that book, are the two terms of baptism of the Holy Spirit or second blessing used? And I know that some Pentecostal churches, for example, United Pentecostal, keep statistics on like a second act of grace, a second blessing. So I'm just interested in learning more about how that was split up into like a third act of grace, and if they would use those terms, baptism of the Holy Spirit and second blessing.
Yeah, by 1900 he was using all of those terms almost interchangeably. Peterson's work, I suspect, but I can't prove it, may be somewhat related to Horner's work in Canada. The question did not, when I was spending more serious time reading Peterson's work in my copies now in Los Angeles, or in, wherever that is, San Diego area, and it's a long ways from me most of the time. But I want to go back, if I get around to it, to look at the connections between him and Horner, because in a sense, there was, throughout as the 19th century comes to a close, there's a lot of people realizing around the world that, this name it and claim it thing for sanctification just didn't work. And that something else must be involved. And the question is, how are we going to discuss that? And Luther and I have had serious discussions over a long period of time about what is this version of holiness that comes out of the missionary experience and the edges of Methodism that is articulated, starts to be articulated in more steps. And of course, in North Carolina, there's a lot of steps. They needed more.
Yes. They need more. Well, time for one more question. Yeah.
There were
Identify yourself to everybody. Tell everybody who you are. Make a friend.
There were Canadians and Americans on Azusa Street in 1906. Were there British people as well who eventually ended up affecting the British Methodist bodies.
Yes, there were British folks there. Most of the ones who went there, stayed there, or went on toward Asia or to Palestine or Southern Africa. But the interesting thing about the development of Pentecostalism in Europe is that it only comes indirectly from Azusa Street. And it comes indirectly because people were programmed to be looking for that next step. Because people had decided this thing just doesn't work the way we thought it was going to. The world has not been evangelized like the two Taylors, James Hudson and William Taylor, demonstrated it could be. This hasn't happened. What's wrong? And they had already decided that the model for spirituality and for Christian identity was where the narratives of Pentecost in the book of Acts. They start reading it. What's missing? Glossolalia. And they hadn't gotten to apostleship yet, but that comes later. But they got to the glossolalia part, and they said, "Aha, that's it. The baptism of the Holy Spirit really includes this," and we've been missing that. And so it was, so they wrote that up in this first fascicle of the Azusa Street paper, which T.B. Barrett read in New York, and said, "Aha." And went off to a church where he could find this happening. And, I read that journal and it didn't do a thing for me. But for him, it set him on a life quest because it answered that question of what next. What have we been missing? What's next?
Everybody join me in thanking David. With this clock, we'll get